Tonight is a truly special night for me. All of us have had people in our lives that have inspired us and had a profound impact on the arc of our lives. There are two people in particular who've had a great influence on my adult life and my Jewish journey. Andy spoke about one of them, my father-in-law, Sherman Minkoff, and tonight it is my incredible pleasure to introduce the other, Rabbi Jack Moline. Joining him here tonight is his wife, Anne. Anne, welcome. Like Sherman, Rabbi Moline is a native of Chicago. He's a graduate of Northwestern University and the Jewish Theological Seminary. In 1987, he became rabbi at Agudas Achim in Alexandria, Virginia, which is where I attended during my high school and college years. He served as rabbi there for 27 years and is now the rabbi emeritus. In addition to serving as rabbi at Agudas, he also served in leadership positions for numerous Jewish, interfaith, political, and community organizations. In fact, far too many for me to list. So in the interest of time, I would simply refer you to his Wikipedia page, which is extensive and impressive. He has been widely recognized as one of the most influential rabbis in our country. He is an author, including his latest Different Chapter, Same Verse, which is a 2-volume commentary with his unique insights on the weekly Parsha, which is also available outside. But what I want to talk about is what my rabbi, Jack Moline, meant to me. I still remember when Rabbi Jack, which is how I've always known him, first arrived at Agudas. He was dynamic and he was funny, which was really important to the Kaplan family. He also was the youngest rabbi I had ever seen. He had long hair, he wore suits with suspenders, and he had the coolest multicolored talit I'd ever seen. In fact, shortly thereafter, I started wearing suspenders and went out and bought the exact same talit that he had. So I don't know that the term influencer had been invented back then, but he certainly was the first. His sermons were sprinkled with pop culture references, from going to Rolling Stones concerts to his beloved Chicago Cubs, which you've heard about. He talked about issues of social conscience and current events, but always through the lens of Jewish values. And at that point in my life, I was just beginning to try to figure out who I was as a person, what was my identity independent of my parents. And throughout my college years, Rabbi Jack was an important influence. I could relate to him. He liked the same kind of music. He loved sports. So I felt a real connection for him. And he was the one who opened my eyes to the possibility that Judaism might have something to offer outside of the four walls of a synagogue. As college graduation approached, he was the person I turned to for advice on significant life decisions. What I remember most is that he listened with patience and empathy, and he spoke with clarity and conviction. He made me want to learn more about Judaism and Jewish wisdom. I wanted to have the kind of clarity and wisdom that he had. And so his advice and his inspiration, I am certain, helped lead me to find my Besheret, Ricky, and to become a part of the Minkoff family. So tonight, these story arcs of Sherman Minkoff and Rabbi Jack Moline intersect. Rabbi Jack, who inspired me to want to live Jewishly, and Sherman Minkoff, who taught me by his example what it means to live Jewishly. And so thank you for allowing me to share a few memories with you all, and for the opportunity to acknowledge and thank Sherman and Rabbi Jack. And without any further schmaltz, I give you my Rabbi, Jack Moline.
I'm almost reluctant to say anything after that. It is an incredible honor to be included in the roster of teachers who have been your guests here at this Valley Bet Midrash event. I'm going to say words that should strike fear into your heart, which is, before I begin my remarks, I'd like to say a few words. First of all, Rabbi, 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 Rabbi. You know, we all hope at the beginning of our careers that at some point along the way, we have one person we've been able to influence, like I had the privilege to influence Michael. So thank you for giving meaning to what I've done. I know a lot of you. I've found out I know more of you than I thought I did before I came in here tonight, but I want to talk to you about relationships I have with two people in this room. One of them is Steve Helfgott. Steve saved my life. I was a fledgling youth advisor in the Chicago area. Steve was a youth director, and we went to where are you? Oh, there you are. I'm looking right at you. We went to a retreat in rural Wisconsin with some of our US wires, and I was, I wore suspenders even before I met Mike. I was a good-looking guy, but I was a staff member. And there was a senior girl there who had her eyes on, and she was attempting to be very persuasive about a dark corner that she knew about. And I came walking through the lobby of the living units that we were in, and Steve was just sitting there. And I don't know how he knew it, but he took one look at me and realized that it was necessary to have a serious conversation with me about nothing. And he kept talking to me and asking me questions, and I was getting weak in the knees, and this young woman was tugging at my wrist, and Steve talked me to the point where I was too tired to do anything else that night. And he saved me from making probably the biggest mistake I could have made that would have ended my career as a youth advisor at that point. I was also there, by the way, when he answered the question of the guy he worked for, the youth commission chairman at his synagogue, as to whether he had to wear a kippah because he was already wearing a toupee. That was a great moment. The other person I want to acknowledge, and I know you're here, I used to be able to see a lot better, is Jerry Hirsch. Right, Jerry. Oh, there's Jerry. So I know there's a variety of political perspectives in this room, but I hope you find this story as much of a hoot as I did, whether or not you are on the left or the right. Jerry took exception to some of the moral characteristics of the man who had just been elected president of the United States in 2016. And through his Lodestar Foundation, decided that he was going to attempt to have President Trump's liquor license revoked from the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. Problem was, he lived in Phoenix, and he needed people who were from D.C. in order to be the complainants to the D.C. Liquor Commission. And so he recruited me. The D.C. Liquor Licensing Board, which had the responsibility to make sure that anybody who actually held a liquor license was a person of good repute, declined to hear the case. So it never went anywhere. But we know that there were ripples that went all the way up into the White House, because the only thing that was making money at the Trump International Hotel back then was the bar. And if its liquor license was revoked, well, the president would have been forced to sell it. By the way, he did. But that's a different story. So it is just a pleasure to be reunited with with these folks. The Helfgots, actually, I've been in 2 or 3 communities where the Helfgots live, and every time I come there, they're out of town. So I'm just very honored that they made it here. I actually have 4 speeches to deliver tonight before we get to your questions. So I'm telling you that it's sort of like a classical music concert. I'm telling you so that you don't applaud or leave before it's all over. So here's the first. I know you recognize what a treasure you have in Rabbi Shmuley. I know you do. The term entrepreneurial rabbi was not invented to describe him, but I cannot identify anyone at this moment of our history who's exemplified the creative approach to the application of the range of rabbinic leadership that Shmuley Yanklowitz has. I will run out of time if I start to list them, so I only want to highlight one. You know that through one of his other projects, Uri Tzedek, he brings showers to unhoused people in the streets. Showers. It's easy to recognize the profound humanity of providing showers for people who find themselves living on the streets without the dignity of accessible hygiene opportunities. In that sense alone, it is a brilliant project. But I'm reminded of a talk that I heard from our teacher, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, about walking through a Northeast winter scene and seeing homes warmed by fires that sent smoke up the chimneys from their hearths. Jews, he said, cannot help but see something additional, something different, when they see chimneys belching smoke. Rabbi Greenberg's lesson was about perception. But Rabbi Shmuley's lesson is about redemption. We see showers differently as well. Last night, Ann and I watched the evening news and saw the tour of Auschwitz that was led by survivors who brought their children and children's children to see where those showers were. Only in our day and age can we boast that we have rounded people up for showers with compassion and respect, and to give them a better sense of their dignity. Actively seeking an opportunity to put the values we declare into practice is a sacred task. It's all the more so when we live in a time when people in our community seemed focused either on congratulating their communities for being the only authentic Jews, or pouring our resources in responding to people who hate us. Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz should not be one of a kind, and I applaud all of you for being on his team. That's the end of speech 1. Here's the second. What is the most important quality for someone to cultivate? And when I say someone, I do not just mean a Jewish someone, but most certainly a Jewish someone. The answer, I think, is generosity. I suggest a very broad definition of generosity, offering what you have to someone in need. Mostly, we think in monetary terms when we think of generosity, but most of us believe we are not financially wealthy enough to be so meaningfully philanthropic. And let me tell you, that's not true. This lesson came to me many years ago. And here's a Cubs story to honor your late husband. I was relatively new in Washington, a young dad with 2 daughters. Money was very tight. But a friend of my father-in-law, a lifelong fan of the Chicago Cubs like me, invited me to join the Emil Verbin Memorial Society. Emil Verbin was a good fielding, poor hitting shortstop for the Cubs the last time they had been in the World Series in the 1940s, which was when my friend Ray was a teenager and I wasn't even a thought. And the Emil Verbin Memorial Society, which was a funny name because Emil Verbin was still alive and well at the time. The Emil Verbin Memorial Society was the club for expatriate Cub fans in Washington, D.C. It is the only club I ever belonged to, along with Ronald Reagan, George Will, and Hillary Clinton. I was very excited to go to that first luncheon, and I invited my father-in-law to accompany me as my guest. The cost was $75 a piece, and that was real money for me back then. After I was seated, I asked for the vegetarian option. There was no vegetarian option. So I wound up with a plate of broccoli. Among the speakers there that day was Kenny Holtzman, now of blessed memory, who was a terrific pitcher for the Cubs. After the program at a meet and greet, I gushed to him like a teenager, which I had been when I saw him pitch. I said, Kenny, I was in the bleachers that day that you pitched the no-hitter against the Dodgers. And he replied, you know, Wrigley Field holds 40,000 people, and I've met all 80,000 who were there that day. I left the lunch feeling very happy. I'd met a childhood hero. I'd hung out with a lot of Cubs fans. I walked out the door of the building where the lunch was and straight past a young man who was standing with a sign in his hands that said, homeless and hungry, 2 kids to feed. And I got about 10 paces beyond him and stopped dead in my tracks. I realized that I had just spent $150 on a plate of broccoli and a conversation with someone I saw from a distance as a teenager. And I walked right past someone my age who couldn't feed himself or his kids. I was humiliated. I turned around, I walked back, shoved my hand in my pocket, pulled out something green, I put it in his cup. And then he said 3 words that devastated me, just cut me to the quick. Those 3 words were, God bless you. For my 60th birthday, which is now a long time ago, my family gave me a small gift, not a small gift. They gave me a gift of a small amount of money and a checkbook. They called it the 60 Fund. And whenever I notice an unsung hero, I use it to send $18, a certificate, and a letter to the person who exemplified either courage, compassion, generosity, or wisdom. The first recipient was a homeless garbage man who dug through a city dump in New York City to find the wedding band of a woman who accidentally dropped it in the trash in a park. 4 teenagers noticed a house on fire and ran in to rescue the occupants. A man on his way home from his final CPR class saved the life of another man who had just collapsed on the street, and that man in turn gave his rescuer the car he could not afford. A school secretary talked an intruder with a gun out of shooting up a building full of children. A school librarian in Florida who objected to the removal of books due to parental objections from the library quit her job and opened a bookstore where those books were available at no charge if necessary. It's a great project. For $18, I feel like a hero, and I recognize some important people in this world. If you want to read about more of them, just Google the 60 Fund and my website will come up. You'll see them all there. I love the 60 Fund. It has made me a micro-philanthropist and enabled me to practice the Jewish value of hakarat hatov, acknowledging the good that's in this world. Now, I'm here today because of the similar values of my fellow Chicago native, Sherman Minkoff, of blessed memory, and his wife, Andy, of celebrated memory. Dr. Minkoff went to the same high school as my father, though many years later, but clearly there was something about that community that inspired people to be generous. You know about his personal history and his illustrious career and the macro philanthropy that established the Minkoff Center for Jewish Genetics, and in his memory, this lecture series that Andy established. All of which to say is generosity is available to the child of a poor tailor from Warsaw, and the child of a small businessman from the west side of Chicago, and the child of a cardiologist from Phoenix who became a reluctant hockey fan. And it is available to you, even if the currency you have to give is a kind word, a ride to the store, your attendance at Minion, a box full of toys, a note of appreciation. It is much of what impelled me into interfaith work. That's the end of speech 2. Here's the third. If you're familiar with the lexicon of Shabbat, you know the word eruv. Likely you think of an eruv as a string attached to poles, often telephone poles or lampposts these days, that allow Shabbat observant Jews to push baby strollers and carry their talesim to shul. But the meaning of the word eruv is one that has evolved from its original meaning. In fact, the word itself means mixture. It is from the same root as the word ma'ariv, which is the evening service, the worship service that's conducted when daylight mixes with darkness. Back in the day, meaning rabbinic times, people in cities typically lived in buildings shaped like almost closed rectangles. Very familiar with these from growing up in Chicago. Here, not so much, although since everything is fenced in here with these adobe walls, you have some sense of what it looked like. What we today would call apartments surrounded a common courtyard. And as you might imagine, people in the buildings were often very close with each other. They were family, they were friends, they were coworkers. And come time for Shabbat, they would want to visit with each other, sharing food or learning, or family members that needed carrying from one apartment to another. So the question is, was that courtyard that they shared in common a private space where it was permitted to carry objects on Shabbat? Or was it a public space because it was open to the street by the entrance to the courtyard and therefore required the prohibiting of carrying objects on Shabbat? Our innovative rabbis, our entrepreneurial rabbis, Reb Shmuly's ancestors, came up with a solution. A symbolic closure was created across the entrance to the courtyard to technically make it a single domain rather than a multifamily collection. But that closure was not the eruv. The eruv was actually a communal meal that was contributed to from every member of that residential unit. There was a plate that was placed in the courtyard, and it collected something from every person who lived there, an act of generosity that was a weekly affirmation that everyone in the building was part of the whole. No one could withhold and no one could be excluded. And in that way, the people who lived together during the week had a tangible reminder that they were part of an equal community, whether they contributed a fig or a pot roast to the eruv. That was what they did. And that is the origin of the term eruv. There is in Washington, D.C., minutes from my home in Alexandria, Virginia, an expanse of land called the National Mall. It is bounded on the north and the south by Constitution Avenue and Independence Avenue, respectively. You can walk across it in 10 minutes. You can drive across it in 35 to 40 minutes. On the western boundary, Abraham Lincoln watches solemnly over the expanse. On the eastern end, the dome of the United States Capitol closes the rectangle. It is our nation's front yard, open to all. While it has more access than the courtyard of the ancient apartment building, it serves the same purpose. Every idea, every belief can be brought to the mall and has been. Each one is protected on either side by independence and constitution, by freedom and by the law. Each one stands between the commitment to freedom of President Lincoln and the commitment to law of our legislators and justices. It's the place that symbolizes our commonality, our unalienable rights, a more and more perfect union where we strive to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to us and our posterity. I know that at an historical moment like this one, it's easy to be cynical about those hoary words, but I promise you, when you walk that lawn, it is what watches over you. One of our kids works for the federal government, and she is both the beneficiary of and the embodiment of those generosities. She knows it every day. You walk through our national eruv the common heritage we share because of our individual and communal contributions. And you see the museums that frame the mall, which are filled with natural history, American history, African American culture, Native American heritage, ancient and modern art. The institutions that frame the mall include the departments of agriculture, justice, health and human services, education. The National Archives is there, the Library of Congress, the Supreme Court. And wonderfully, there's a carousel there to make clear that children always have a place at the center of our national imagination. There are monuments to presidents, to legislators, to judges, generals, immigrants, and foreign nationals. There are memorials there to people who made the ultimate sacrifice preserving our way of life. And I imagine that some of you who are here tonight have family members who are memorialized on the mall. Every summer, a rotating collection of folklife exhibits highlights the gifts to and from the United States. Every spring, there's a festival of kites. And every year on Independence Day, there were fireworks and symphonies, and we celebrate who we are. This is the eruv for our nation. It is what we have in common. It is what we share with our neighbors. The gifts of our lives open to all. And here's what you will not find anywhere on the National Mall. Here's what our founders and our builders and our landscapers have wisely decided is not to be established on America's front lawn. Religion. Your religion, whatever it is and however you define it, is what you bring to that eruv, but it's what you take with you when you leave. There is no structure to any faith tradition on the National Mall, just as the Constitution that watches over it allows no religious test for office, no establishment or disestablishment of religious profession, no independent belief or disbelief that does not enjoy the protection of freedom and the law that surrounds it. Any attempt to establish a permanent presence of religion on our nation's front lawn must be met always with impatience and principle. And America has smaller front lawns all throughout the country. There's one here in Phoenix and in 49 other state capitals, in front of thousands of city halls and village government centers, and certainly at polling places. The United States of America is the most religiously conscious country in the world. I'm not kidding about that. So if our moral and ethical guidance cannot come from religion, then where do we find it? And with that question, I end speech number 3. I spent the last years of my working career at the helm of Interfaith Alliance. It's worth your knowing a little bit about it. In 1994, an unholy alliance between cynical political conservatives and radically right evangelical Protestants conspired to upend some of the bedrock principles of American society. For conservatives, the goal was smaller government and freer enterprise. For evangelicals, it was the preservation of what they perceived as the hegemony of white evangelical Protestants who, out of sufferance, tolerated other Christians, Roman Catholics, and Jews, but considered those who would not affirm the dominion of the King James Bible to be citizens of a lesser status. It seemed almost like a cartoon squabble played out on cable television on a program that most people never watched. It was called the Old Time Gospel Hour. The host was Reverend Jerry Falwell Sr., and his preaching in Lynchburg, Virginia, was matched and expanded on the other side of the state by Reverend Pat Robertson. They are both gone, but their legacy persists. Meanwhile, a slightly less unholy alliance between Democratic Party operatives and liberal clergy arose to do combat. But the clergy, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, and shortly thereafter, Muslim, Sikh, and Buddhist, were having none of the direction that the Democratic operatives were offering. They doubled down on the Constitution and declared as a matter of faith that, as we say in Aramaic, Dina de Malchuta Dina, which you all know means the law of the land is the law. And that very principled stand is what energized my predecessor, Reverend Welton Gaddy. Reverend Gaddy was raised and ordained a Southern Baptist, but he was persuaded that he was one of the few authentic Baptists left after the denomination took a hard turn to the right. Walter Cronkite retired from his years of anchoring the CBS Evening News, embraced the mission of Interfaith Alliance. He was known as the most trusted man in America, and when he retired, he trusted Interfaith Alliance. And anytime Interfaith Alliance veered off that message, we'd get a phone call from Mr. Cronkite, who, with clear-eyed insistence, reminded Welton that the challenge to America, the one he signed on to endorse, was from a religious extremism and not whatever the issue du jour was. Our task was more than claiming that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's an important sentiment and an endorsable cri de coeur, but it is not enough. Interfaith Alliance took the next step. I had the sad privilege to articulate it 3 days after the 2016 election, when the president-elect, and now the president-elect, announced his intentions to register Muslims. If that happened, I said, in front of the National Mosque, then register me. I am a Muslim. That's the legacy I inherited. If I'm denied the right to vote because I'm Black or poor or speak a different primary language, then I am Black or poor or speak a different primary language. If I cannot marry because I am gay, then I am gay. And if I'm prohibited to hold public office because I proclaim Jesus Christ to be my Lord and Savior, then I, even I, proclaim Jesus Christ to be my Lord and Savior. Radical empathy is what our Constitution demands, and it is what my faith teaches. It is the only semi-religious belief that has standing in this country, that all people are created equal. It comes, I hope you know, from the very beginning of the Bible, at least for Jews and Christians. The first human being was created so that no one can say, my father was greater than your father. And centuries later, at exactly the same time in history, the Mishnah and the Quran both taught one who preserves a single life preserves an entire world. But the only place that notion matters on America's front lawn is in the Constitution, which for all its flaws demands that we are all entitled to equal protection and equal opportunity. Radical empathy. All this other stuff challenging our country, our democracy, our citizens are the results, not the cause, of our losing sight of the value of every human soul and every person's rights. Returning Toni Morrison or Anne Frank to a library is a victory in a skirmish. Unlocking doors to a reproductive clinic is a correction of an act of bullying. Making artisanal baked goods available for a lesbian wedding is a repudiation of a person's prejudice. But the cause of the effect, the belief on the part of a large minority with outsized influence that their convictions must be affirmed by our society, even at the cost of human rights, articulated in our only sacred document that governs the United States, the Constitution. The cause of that effect demands not only a tactical approach, not only an issue approach, not only a coalition of the willing approach. The cause of that effect cannot be addressed by setting up a boogeyman with whatever name is current at the moment: the Christian Coalition, the Moral Majority, the Value Voters, the Tea Party, white pride, Christian nationalism. Those aren't the problem. It must be addressed by the words and the deeds that emerge from the heart and enter the heart. Empathy, radical empathy, can be very hard, especially when we have limited sympathy for some people in our community. What radical empathy asks of you is to hold precious the people you cross the street to avoid, who attend the houses of worship you will not, who eat the foods you abhor, who speak the languages you do not understand, who affirm the sacred texts to which you object, and who look askance at you for the very same reasons. Without teaching and modeling that the great blessing of America is less about celebrating what we have in common than protecting what makes us so different from one another, this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated will not long endure. Modeling that behavior is a philanthropic gift that you as a Jew can offer to all of us as Americans. It is an act of generosity. Cultivating a generosity of spirit and practicing radical empathy is within the capability of every person, but I emphasize that it must be cultivated and practiced, just like every mitzvah. It is not organic. It is not natural. It is not our default setting. The Constitution, like the Torah, the Havdil, calls on us to rise above our selfishness and rise above our self-interest and do our part to form a more perfect union. About a year ago, an essay appeared in the Washington Post written by columnist Kate Cohen, who had written a book declaring herself publicly to be an atheist. God bless her. In my days at Interfaith Alliance, her right to be unfettered by the arrogance of religious practitioners was just as much our concern as anyone professing a faith. Most of the essay was her critique. Most of the essay was her denigration of the entire endeavor of religious devotion. You've heard it all before, although not always as eloquently. Religion is too privileged and not responsible enough. It is arrogant even in professing its compassion. It is invested in a fantasy and disconnected from reality. It is the source of oppression, of bigotry, of divisiveness, abuse, hatred, and repressiveness. Now, you may find that offensive, but you know what? She's not wrong. I'm not sure she's right, but she's not wrong. You and I cannot go back to our synagogues and run the risk of being lulled into complacency when we have allowed so many Americans and so many others to see what we do in our faith communities as sowing a sense of division with those so unlike ourselves. Radical empathy is not only for the public square. It is for your sanctuary. It is for your Torah study. It is for your family table. It applies to your uncle, the MAGA Republican, and to your aunt, the socialist, to that kid from another religion or no religion at all that your cousin is dating. Not to affirm that they're right, but to affirm their rights. For us, supporting beliefs and convictions and faiths must be an inviolable matter of the Constitution, and supporting the Constitution must be an inviolable matter of faith. That's the only way our country can work. I hope you have joined Reb Shmuley in advancing the cause so that it does not take so many years to change the hearts and minds of another generation. And I will tell you, for that singular achievement, I rely on you. And so does this beloved country. And so, my friends, does the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So the question is, how do we cultivate radical empathy within ourselves? And a related but actually separate question is, how do we change the tenor of discourse in this country? So the answer begins with each of us, right? Shmuley and I were talking about this earlier today. You know, the easiest thing to do is to identify somebody who's violating these principles and call them out on it and humiliate them and make them feel terrible and try to shame them into being the kind of person they need to be. But folks, you know, when that's done to you, you go right to the polls and vote for the other person, right? That isn't going to do it. The work needs to be done internally. I already told a story about my hormonal teenagehood. I will tell another story about when I was even younger. Um, it was a time when humor was not as politically astute as it is today. And I remember telling an uncle of mine a joke about an ethnic minority, I won't name it, that I thought was hysterical. And he looked at me and he said very kindly, we know a lot of people who are from that community and we don't make fun of them. That was a very important lesson for me, an extraordinarily important message for me. And it put a governor on me, right? I won't tell you that my humor is always appropriate. My wife can attest to that. But I will tell you that the work that needed to be done in that moment was me on me and not someone else putting up guardrails so that I couldn't say the wrong thing. And I think that's what needs to be done. That's what I hope I conveyed in those last words. It's not just happening in the streets with somebody else. It's happening in rooms like these, however inadvertently. We have to open our ears and hear it. Jerry's going to hear a panel on the First Amendment and free speech and its impact on how we discuss Israel's war with Gaza, with Hamas, more accurately, and wondering if I could comment on whether there is a relevance there. So, look, of course there's a relevance there. I will say that no matter how I feel about that conflict, the fact is you're going to hear that conversation in Phoenix, Arizona, and not in Gaza City or Jerusalem. So once again, it's important to talk about these things, but nothing's going to be resolved by other people talking about what a third party should be doing. So that's number one. But number two, every legal ruling depends not just on the legislature that enacts it, but on the willingness of those who have agreed to be governed by those rules to observe it. You go through a red light, you're going to get a ticket. It doesn't matter what your excuse was. The judge may be lenient, the cop may let you go, but you broke the law. You eat a ham sandwich on Yom Kippur, it doesn't matter how much of an atheist you are or how ridiculous you think those rituals are. From the point of view of mitzvah observance, you broke the law. So once we decide that the laws only apply to other people and not to us, you have a breakdown of everything. If there's anything that applies to the conflict in the Middle East, it is that a lot of people only want the law upheld by the other side. And what we really need to be doing, especially when it comes to the First Amendment, is honoring the right of people to say what they need to say, not trying to restrict it. Radical empathy is hard, and it's not something that can be generated immediately, and it's particularly difficult when there are people in your sphere who are themselves not modeling radical empathy in your presence. And that you quoted Dr. King, who stated that peace was not the objective, it was the starting point. The goal was to be, and I'll use his words, a beloved community. So how do we deal with situations that are fraught when there are people who do not share our appreciation of the value of radical empathy? Look, I didn't say it was easy. And I also didn't say I was going to stick around after I made this to train you in how to do it. It's a hard thing to do. I don't mean to be flip about this. My brother is a Chicago White Sox fan. We shared a room and it was a combat zone frequently. And we fought. I mean, there were times when we really believed we hated each other. We did, to the point where my father gave up his office in the house so that we could have separate bedrooms because they just couldn't stand us fighting with each other anymore, right? I had no empathy for him. He certainly had no empathy for me. And probably the greatest relief of my life was when the boundaries for school districting changed and he went to a different high school than I did. So we weren't there together. But you know what? I love my brother and I'm close to him now. And I had to work on it and he had to work on it too, because the relationship was that important. And you're not going to succeed the first time you try to be empathetic with someone whose ideas and behaviors are noxious to you. Those of you who have family members, friends who are struggling with problems that you can't understand how they allow themselves to fall into some sort of compulsive behavior, or particularly if they're deceitful about it, you're probably furious with them, but you wouldn't be furious if you didn't love them, if you didn't see some value in the relationship. I sound like I'm a great guy about this. I'm a real expert. I try not to talk to my next door neighbor if I can at all avoid it. I don't have a lot of empathy for him, let alone radical empathy for him, because we just have different values. But it doesn't mean that I can give up and say he's not worth it as a human being. Every human being represents a world in this universe in which we live. And if we take our place as the master of a universe ourselves, we have to be willing to understand how that is for everybody else and to do what we can. So take it slow, Maybe you don't invite them for Thanksgiving, just for the football game afterwards, but take it slow. Okay, so I have an answer. I'm not sure how it's going to sit with most people in this room. I know how it's going to sit with you, okay? Question is, how do we wake ourselves up when we're not feeling the love? And my answer is to daven. If you take 5 minutes a day to read, don't pray, just read, to read the weekday Amidah and the mandates that are ours because of our relationship with the Holy One, you will have a menu of how to comport yourself in this world. You don't want to daven? Look in the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, it says there are, I'm trying to remember where it is. I'm pretty sure it's Sota. I'm not positive. There are a number of things that are fulfilled without measure in this world. I'm sorry I don't have this exactly committed to memory. Visiting the sick, burying the dead, providing for a poor bride, welcoming strangers into your home. There's a whole list of practices that are commended to us by our tradition, because though we have to cultivate radical empathy within, it doesn't come from within. With all due respect to my friends who are secularists and atheists, there is not enough stuff inside any human being to understand that the needs I have for my basic needs, for my clothing, for my companionship, for my family, the needs I have will somehow always trump the right thing to do for other people. So we need to be reminded from an external source. And friends, those of you who are Jewish, I got to tell you, you got a prayer book that will tell you exactly what kinds of things to think about. And those of you who are not Jewish, I hear there's some pretty good things in other scriptures as well, and in other liturgies as well, that will remind you to be, as you heard at the very beginning of this evening, to be kind. And if you can be kind with yourself, you will learn to be kind with others. And if you are kind with others, if it doesn't make them kind to you, it will drive them absolutely crazy.
Friends on Zoom, thank you for joining us. Oh, I see you over there. Wonderful to have you with us. And have a beautiful night. Thank you so much. God bless.